Thanks for that reading, Noah. And now we'll call forward Uncle Steve to talk to how to deal with disappointment.
Thanks, Jake, and good evening, everybody. Apologies up front. Now, I know you look forward to this event every year with great anticipation, and you're probably mostly looking to an international dynamic speaker from overseas that you've never ever heard before, and you've got me, so apologies. And that's why I thought this would be a really appropriate subject for tonight, dealing with disappointment. So we've put it straight out there, how are we going to deal with disappointment? And of course, when you go home tonight, you'll be able to talk to your parents. Hopefully we all still do that, or maybe SMS them, or whatever you do these days. And when they say, what was it like tonight, you'll be able to say, really disappointing. But hopefully that's just the topic and not the content. Hopefully the content you'll find reassuring and helpful, I think particularly for us in 2025 as we face a myriad of issues and problems, young people and older people like myself as well. It's not normally a subject that I consider, but I think, we like to focus on the superheroes of the Bible, all these amazing people like Joshua and David and Paul and Moses, who sort of came out of obscurity and they reached these amazing heights. And I guess in some ways we find that inspirational, but maybe for ourselves, that's not just me, or that's not how I feel, or I don't think I can achieve this. So, that's why we want to talk tonight about how do we deal with disappointment. And I think we've got a really good example in Elijah, because if anyone set a high mark or a high goal to achieve, it was Elijah, because his commission was to change the whole nation. Of course, Ahab and Jezebel were king and queen at the time, and as one of the greatest prophets of Israel, he sort of came out of obscurity straight into the throne room of Ahab and Jezebel, confronted them with a finger and said there's going to be no rain for 3.5 years. A very sort of dynamic picture. And he was devastated because he thought he could reinvent the whole nation and shift their worship from the worship of Baal to the worship of God. From Mount Carmel, remember the incident of Mount Carmel brought down fire from heaven. He thought he could change the nation, and it all fell apart. And he ended up in chapter 19 here saying, take my life, I'm not a prophet, I've achieved nothing, I'm worthless. So I think, if we can align ourselves with the feelings of Elijah and see how God handled this situation and how, in a very positive way, we can deal with disappointment, well, that'll be pretty helpful. And of course, one of the things we need to be able to deal with as young people, we've got our whole life before us. We've got to be able to deal sometimes with issues that arise and things that we need to overcome. So we want to look at a Bible strategy, because that gives us a framework and a groundwork from where we can move from. And we're talking about Elijah. Now, James in the New Testament picks up on this very essence, and he says Elijah had the same passions as we do. So he loved his God, he was enthusiastic, he had all the good elements to start off with, but as I say, it all fell apart. He had the same nature as us. Sometimes we look at these great individuals and we think, wow, they were like robots. They just sort of streamed through life and everything worked out well for them. But no, it didn't. And as we look at the Bible characters, we'll see lots of ups and downs in their own life. So immediately, I think all of us can identify with a man who was very passionate, a man who was very emotional, a man who had his ups and downs in life. So dealing with disappointment. What is disappointment? I don't know. Is anyone brave enough to throw out a definition of disappointment? And don't say, listening to Uncle Steve. That would be really awkward. What do we think about disappointment? What is it? Can we define it? Any thoughts? Does anyone sort of... I won't be disappointed in your definition of disappointment, put it that way. Well, that's perfect. And I reckon you must have heard my talk before, because that's the perfect formula I've got. Not living up to our expectations. We sort of define who we think we are going to become, and sometimes We get frustrated with ourselves, or it might be with another person that we're friendly with. We are disappointed in the relationship or the friendship. So it's a feeling of defeat or failure, frustration. We all have those elements. We see them particularly in Elijah. Dissatisfaction, letdown, things that we thought would happen that don't happen in our lives. So there it is there. Disappointment is a high-level expectation over reality. So we set our expectations up here, and either we don't meet them or the people around us don't meet them, and we feel, well, disappointment. So there's the slide there. Perfect answer. Well done. So looking at things that disappoint us in life, things that cause disappointment. Okay, here's an easy one for you. What are some of the things that cause disappointment? And I hope the girls aren't going to say my boyfriend who's sitting next to me, or the reverse of that, because that, again, would be very, very awkward. I'm not sure I could recover from that, but, you know, we'll see. What things cause us disappointment? I don't want to hear parents. What things cause us disappointment in life? It's pretty broad. Any thoughts? Okay, so that's a good one. Personal expectations. As we say, we set goals in life. You know, in school, we sort of map out a bit of a career as to where we want to go, and then we, you know, fail a number of exams and we don't achieve what we want to achieve. So certainly in ourselves. What else have we got? Yeah, well, we've all been there for that. And let me assure you, I had bad grades in school, but hey, here I am. So, you know, maybe I achieved more than I ever thought I would. So, yeah, bad grades in school. Yeah. Failing to reach our goals. Now, as we go through life, we have different levels of expectation. I guess as a teenager, we sort of think, you know, what's important to me? Good grades in school, getting a job, getting a career, being paid well, maybe having a good relationship, a family, you know, on it goes. So we've got lots of goals that we set, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. Well, you know, here's some pictures here, and I think we all started off right with this point, looking at our parents, thinking, I've got a bad deal. So, you know, disappointment right there at the beginning of life. That's one of the things. You know, something gets delivered from Amazon. You've sort of bought something and you think that's a good bargain, and you get it and the guy's forgotten to pack it in the box. And you open up and there's nothing there. That's a, you know, disappointment. I'm a hopeless fisher person. Auntie Beth is amazing. Never take her in the boat with you, all right? Just a word of advice, because she will be pulling in fish, double headers, and this is about what I get. So, you know, disappointment again. Job applications. How many of you guys have, you know, put in applications and you get rejected? And that can lead to, again, a feeling of disappointment. This one's a big one for me. You know, you're visiting somewhere, and I've got some stories to tell, but I haven't got enough time to tell them. But, you know, you go there, utter disappointment, or one might say, you know, exasperation, or desperation maybe. So, yeah, that's always awkward. Or this one here, I guess you've all had that, where you've stood in a long line for about half an hour to get your ice cream. You finally get it and you go for your first lick, and boom, onto the ground, and, you know, what happens from there? Sports. If we're into sports, you know, feeling of frustration, golf, you're just that, you know, 5 millimetres away from where it should be. Our team, yeah, you know, and we display it in different ways, I guess. Some are more sort of outward in our demonstrations, other of us are a little bit more inward. And relationships are a big one. You guys are all in the zone now where sort of relationships become important, and sometimes they don't work out. This one's one for me, back when Facebook was a popular thing. 5,807 friend requests and no replies. So, you know, awkward, no friends, embarrassing. So that's one of the things that, you know, can cause us disappointments. So there's a lot of other areas as well which he didn't talk about, like health can be one. And that's often something that is beyond our control. There may be issues that we have as we get older, particularly with our health. It can be relationships, we've talked about that, work and financial areas. It can be personal low self-esteem. We just don't feel as though we're a person that is unique, and our identity is important to us and to others. Education, we struggle with that. And then, of course, I put on that probably the most important one, spiritual dimension in life as to where we position ourselves in following the Lord Jesus Christ. So, you know, they're areas that we all face. So the thing that is important, and I want to tell you, if you're feeling disappointed with this talk, that's okay, that's normal. I've given a lot of talks that people have been disappointed with. Auntie Beth always says it's the worst talk she's ever heard in her life, so I've been able to deal with disappointment from a personal experience, so there it goes. It's normal, it happens to everybody. In fact, look at that second point there I've got. It's essential for us to learn to overcome. Now, we all look at disappointment in a very negative way, as though, you know, it's something that we should try and walk away from. In reality, you could open your Bible on any particular page and you'll find a person there who is dealing with disappointment, but they learn through experience how to work through those obstacles. And this is the key to life. It's beneficial. It prompts us to seek solutions. So again, you know, in a marriage relationship, it's the beauty of a husband and wife, because the way I see things is a different way to Auntie Beth sees them, and sometimes she's got a better solution, and it's a learning experience for me. So disappointments can actually be helpful and beneficial. And also, if we're talking to someone else and they've got disappointments they're offloading onto us, we can actually help those other people, maybe if we've been through that experience, or just through, you know, who we are. And I got a quote there from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says, it's the trials that all of us face in the constitution of this world that we live in now. So don't feel awkward about disappointment. It's something that we all use as a learning experience through life to build us into greater people and people that can overcome. You know, when I did this talk in New Zealand last year at the Bible school, and it was a smaller group, and I had a little box, and everyone had a piece of paper, and I said, look, write down something that you have been disappointed with, and put it in the box, and at the end of the session, I'll answer them all and give you the reassurance that, you know, there are answers. Anyway, there was one there, I don't know if we've got any New Zealand here, I read the piece of paper, and it said, I've lost my riz. So some of you, I had no idea what that meant. I don't know if it's a New Zealand term, but obviously for those that don't know, it's like charisma, especially in a romantic connection term. So anyway, you know, sort of interesting when you open up the box of disappointments and you pull all these pieces of paper out, you know, what's this all about? So I want to define 3 areas of disappointment. Does anyone want to have a go where they might be? There's 3 main areas of disappointment. Any thoughts? Well, number 1 is ourselves. Number 2 is other people. Number 3, I wonder what number 3 would be. It's actually disappointed with God, all right? Because when you layer the experience of Elijah here, you know, he's sort of disappointed with himself, he's disappointed with the nation, but he's also disappointed with God. And so God's going to sort of bring him round a circle to explain and help him to understand that. So we need to be aware that they're the 3 areas. So disappointed with ourselves, we've got to learn to adjust to life. Okay, the lessons are about choices, wise choices. Sometimes we make the wrong choice and we're disappointed, learning curve for us. So it becomes quite practical. And also it helps us perhaps to view a situation from a different perspective, all right? If we've gone down the same pathway several times and we're always disappointed, hey, maybe we need to go in a different direction, all right? So it helps open up options for us to consider. So disappointed with other people, well, we're all here, and I know sort of we're all in different stages as to relationships and connections with people. Some of us find it very easy to extend ourselves out and be in a conversation with a group. Others of us sort of a little bit more isolated, and we struggle with that. But we're certainly, somewhere in our lives, are going to be disappointed with another person. And maybe, well, I'm sure you've already had that experience, especially if you've got brothers and sisters. I mean, they're a big disappointment, right? So we look at other people and they might not meet our expectations. We might have what we thought a solid friendship, and then someone says something about us and we think, well, that's pretty disappointing. So I've got on the last point. We're often hurt and disappointed by the ones we love and admire the most. but I've got the standout exception, thankfully, is Jesus Christ. So for all of us, how wonderful as a youth group to get here. Our focus is not simply on ourselves and other people. In the long run, it's our thankfulness and appreciation for the life, the example, and the lessons we learn from the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's fantastic when we're looking at the life of Jesus Christ. Some of the outcomes that occur when we allow ourselves to be soaked in disappointment and we lock ourselves in our room, we turn the light off, and we sit in darkness and we think, what is life all about? And it leads to fragility, anxiety, and actually depression, obviously, because we just sort of lower ourselves into that pit and we sort of feel comfortable there, and we need someone to help us back out. When we're disappointed with other people, well, we know what happens there as well. Criticism, anger perhaps, and even a level of hypocrisy. We point the finger at everybody else and we fail to sort of realise what's going on with ourselves. So we've got a little note here that worry doesn't empty tomorrow of its sorrow, it empties today of its strength. We can be consumed with a problem in our life, and that just comes to the forefront of our minds. It weighs us down, and we have no strength to progress, beyond that. And so that's, the life of Elijah. You'll notice that in verse 3. Jezebel sends out a threat to Elijah, and she basically says, "You're a dead man." And verse 3 says, when he saw that, he arose and he went for his life. So you notice it doesn't say when he heard that. It says when he saw that. So he's visualising the outcome of Jezebel, and it just was overwhelming for Elijah, and he couldn't go beyond that. And so that's when he began his journey down to Mount Sinai. Now, Elijah had faced a lot of issues in life. He faced a famine for 3 years. He resurrected a dead boy. He decimated the prophets of Baal. He saw a lot of miracles. So he'd been through a lot of experiences in his life, but he still was particularly upset about the threat from Jezebel. So we'll note there that he went for his life in verse 3 there. So here's this amazing picture of Elijah, who fearlessly destroyed 450 prophets of Baal almost single-handedly on Mount Carmel. Like, what an amazing victory for him. But so quickly he descends from Mount Carmel and he's journeying through the wilderness, through the desert. He's overwhelmed and he asks for his life to be taken. So sometimes we can go to emotional extremes in our own lives when we're confronted with issues that we don't know where there's a solution. And you'll notice as well that he just didn't run away. The record says he went as far as Beersheba, which is on the border of the land. You'll see that again in verse 3. Why is the mention of Beersheba? He came to Beersheba. Remember the scriptures, Dan and Beersheba were the sort of north and south boundaries. So what it's telling us is he went right to the fringe of the nation and beyond because he was overwhelmed with what was happening. And again, what happens when we get into this situation? The brain releases chemicals called dopamine. It helps numb the brain from pain, but it also allows random behaviour. So we don't often think clearly when we get under this sort of stress level. And this is what was happening to Elijah as well. He's fully under stress and a sort of a random journey right down to Beersheba and beyond. And you'll notice as well, the first step is at the end of verse 3, a little piece of narrative, I guess. Just says, and he left his servant there, right? At the end of verse 3. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's sort of what we do when we're disappointed with ourselves or with others. We actually cut off relationships, don't we? We think, well, no one loves me, so I'm not going to return the calls, I'm not going to send an email. And so we cut off ourselves. And we can see this is the beginning of the process here for Elijah. There's some isolation and disconnection. And that's not a helpful operation when we're cutting people off, because they're the very source of encouragement and redirection. So he felt he was on his own, and of course we become bitter, cynical or depressed. We complain. We might even go to a different ecclesia because well, everyone knows my history and what I've done. Stop attending the meetings. We don't want to converse or explain our behaviour. We lose our faith and confidence in God. Well, this one's for me, become old and grumpy. So that's what happens. And that's exactly where Elijah is. He's disconnecting himself and he's going to go it alone. So, that's part of the journey here. Well, notice in verse 4, it says, amazing that he requested for himself that he might die. So, he's physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. He spent 3.5 years to the build-up on Mount Carmel. It hasn't worked out, and it's just all falling apart. So, the negative outcomes of disappointment. This is what people start to say. People aren't friendly, I don't like the talks, there's no unity. People gossip about me, the arranging brethren are hypocrites, people seem to snub me, the exhorting brother had an affair, no one returns my phone call. Maybe we've even said one of those statements in our life. And you can see this disconnection with Elijah from the nation, from his ecclesia, from his people, from the servant. And, this is the sort of phraseology that we start to accommodate ourselves as we undergo this process of disconnection. So, look, I'm just saying, it's great that you guys are here tonight because we want to make those connections. They're really important to us. We can lean on somebody else when we get through times of toughness, and it's important for us to maintain that network. So these are the things that happen to us. And for Elijah, it was a bit of a problem. And in some ways, he was disappointed with God. I mean, this is where ultimately our equation goes. We sort of say, well, I'm sure Elijah did. Why did God allow this to happen? There I was on Mount Carmel. Prophets of Baal were decimated. The nation could have been changed. Why did God not allow that to happen? And we sometimes say that in our own lives as well, don't we? Why did my mum or dad get terminal cancer? I can't understand it. They're wonderful parents, they've been good to me. Suddenly they have a sickness. I do not understand that. In essence, we're challenging God as to this situation. We all have our different versions of why is this happening, and we're appreciating, of course, from Elijah's perspective, he just didn't understand it, and ultimately he starts to blame God. God could change the situation. Why is he not changing it? Well, it may be that we need to learn a lesson in life of a choice that we've made, or it may be that what we're going through will positively benefit another person, maybe later on in life. So the experiences that we go through, if we endure them, may be helpful for us to encourage another. And of course, we're reading from the Bible that has hundreds of characters from which we benefit. And Job went through tough times. I mean, he lost all his kids. And we can read that and we can be stunned at the measure of his faith, and that can be very encouraging. So, we are disappointed with God at times. We question that, and we find the solution as well. So I've got to note here, God doesn't delight in allowing pain and heartache, but he does have a purpose in the grief he allows. He doesn't always send that. We live in a world where things happen, like cancers and terminal illnesses. We live in a constitution where that occurs, and God can allow that to happen, maybe to help us, to firm up our faith, to make us choose right, or perhaps to help somebody else as well. Romans 8:28, Paul writes from great experience. He says, we know that God is always at work for the good of everyone who loves him. They are the ones God has chosen for his purpose. So life is an education process on how to deal with disappointment in this world, in the here and now, in the present, because there's a better world to come, and that's what we're all working towards. So that's important. So let's have a think about this. Just want to go through these three: disappointed with ourselves or themselves, disappointed with others, disappointed with God. Now I want you to think about Bible characters who were disappointed with themselves. Throw out some people who were disappointed with themselves. Who is that? David? Was that David? Yeah, good example. David, a man after God's own heart, incredibly wonderful And why is it that we love David? You know why? Because he was a man of compassion and mercy, and he came to understand his own heart and mind, and he sought to repair and rebuild that with his relationship with his God, received that mercy, and he was ever thankful for it. So David certainly was disappointed with some of the choices that he made. Any others? Jeremiah, great prophet. You know, what I find interesting about Jeremiah is at the end of his life, he looked around, he saw Jerusalem, and you know what it was? A smouldering heap of ash. Babylon had burnt Jerusalem to the ground. That was his life's work. You know what? You'd be disappointed with yourself, wouldn't you, if you spent decades preaching the word of God and hoping the nation would turn to it, and in the end, there's your life's work. It's all burnt to rubble. And then he writes the beautiful book of Lamentations, which says, God's mercies are new every morning. Amazing. Jeremiah's a great one. Anyone else? Okay, we've got Moses and we've got Peter. Moses, again, what an interesting example Moses is. There he was thinking he's the man, because he's been educated in the University of Egypt and he's got all this wisdom and knowledge and power. He takes out a guy with his fist, and then he realised that wasn't the way that God wanted. So he spent another 40 years learning that lesson before he was sufficient enough to lead the nation of Israel. Peter is a great example as well. You know, solid assurance to Jesus that he's going to walk in his footsteps and he's going to die in a pool of blood for Jesus. And then a maidservant says, hey, weren't you a disciple? And he fell to bits. So you see, these are the examples that I put down. David, his sin with Bathsheba, what was the outcome? He learned about forgiveness. Paul, remember in Romans 7, I'm a wretched man. How can I achieve the kingdom? Only through the mercy and grace of Jesus Christ. Adam and Eve, how disappointed do you think they would have been? You know, at Adam's birthday, was he 960 years old? He looks back on the world and it's chaotic. Disappointed, sought God's mercy through the choices they make. Elijah, we're looking at that. Peter, we've had. Well, I got Zacchaeus because of his physical size. Like, you know, sometimes, you know, whether we're tall or, well, you know, I'm getting to be sort of horizontally challenged now that I'm getting older in years. So our physical features aren't always the ones that we sort of pride ourselves in. But there's a list there, and you could go on. All right, what about disappointed with others? Who in the Bible was disappointed with someone else? Jonah. So who is Jonah disappointed with? Okay, with all Israel. And Nineveh. And probably in some senses with God, because he was commissioned to impart mercy to the people of Nineveh, and he didn't want to do that. He's thinking, the message should be for Israel. Why is it going to Nineveh? So, yeah, there's a grouping there. Anyone else? Judas Iscariot, yeah, I'm sure. Well, the ultimate and sad end of Judas's life is that he felt, and in his words, he betrayed an innocent person. And so those 3 years of ministry walking with the Lord Jesus Christ through tough times, and he made a choice for 30 pieces of silver, and in the end he threw them on the ground because they weren't worth anything to him. And yeah, sad choice. So he was, in fact, I guess building on that, you could say, in some ways he was disappointed with Jesus Christ because he didn't think Jesus was going on the pathway that Judas thought he should have gone on. So, yeah, anyone else? Anyone else got a good example? God with the children of Israel. Great example, of course. Here's God working with his people and still working with the people of Israel. I mean, amazing. After thousands of years, he's still working with his people, natural Israel, the descendants of Abraham, to bring them to a point of recognition of the Messiah. So God disappointed with the nation of Israel. So we've got Peter with Ananias and Sapphira, dishonest, and it exposed their faults. Paul with Peter, again, there was a bit of an argument. Joseph with his brothers, they were envious, but in the end, the brothers were saved. So he was disappointed with their original attitude. Paul with John Mark. Remember John Mark had an enthusiasm to go with Paul in the early stages, but he just couldn't go the distance, and Paul was disappointed in him. Thought he could have achieved that. Joseph and Mary, imagine being Joseph and here or Mary's pregnant, what's going on there? But of course he became very faithful. Caleb with the spies, 38 years of wandering in a desert because of, well, the rest of the nation, and especially the 10 spies that gave a bad report. So, yeah, interesting. So here we come. What about people who are disappointed with God? Any thoughts? Yeah, okay, so this is on a good day for David, like the happiest day of his life. He's got a whole lot of things organised. He's got the ark coming out, and of course, as we know, they chucked it on a cart, and Uzzah put out his hand, and boom, lightning bolt, and the whole thing ground to a halt, and David was distressed because this was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, and it became a day of sadness. Yeah, what was God doing? Okay, anyone else? Jonah, disappointed with God. Do you want to explain? Yeah, exactly right. And big lesson for him to learn. He had to go through that whole lesson. He wanted to run away from God because he didn't want to do what he thought God wanted him to do, which he thought wasn't appropriate. So he did a whole circle. And yeah, Jonah, disappointed with God. Yeah, anyone else? Okay. Well, let's go with Job for the minute. So thinking about that's quite a good example, isn't it? Because Job was living, I sort of hesitate to say a perfect life, but he is described as being perfect and upright. So he's living a good life in the truth. And then all of a sudden he loses all his assets, his wealth, and his family and his health, layer upon layer upon layer. And he was certainly perplexed and asked God, what is going on? So there, when you start to think about it, there are a lot of examples of people who are disappointed with God. So when you as a young person start to think, what is God doing? That's okay. It's exercising your mind. As long as we exercise it within a right framework and realise that there might be some benefit to us in having a think about where we're going. So Hannah had no children. John the Baptist was thrown in prison. Habakkuk said, why don't I see judgment on the nation of Israel? Job's wife cursed God. She said to Job to do that. Moses was wondering what was going on. And David, of course, we talked about as well. So that's some real life examples, I guess, from the Bible about what the point of that is. So I've just got a comment here, and I'm hoping to shift the paradigm or the mindset that disappointment is something that's really negative and it has bad outcomes. If we use it appropriately, I've got here, there are openings to grow spiritually and opportunities to show and grow in love. Right, so whether we're disappointed with ourselves, it's an opportunity for growth, or if we see it in someone else's life, an opportunity for us to jump in and reach out to that person to try and help. And we're in that process, we're both educated. So, of course, James again talks about the trials of life, and he says, if we look at the end result, it's actually good for us. Perseverance, he says, has got to finish its work so that we are mature and complete and we have a broadness of experience. That's what I found in my life. Like, I can remember as a young person, I had all the answers. Well, I thought I did. But, you see things black and white. This is the answer, this is the answer. And as you become older, because you've dealt with a lot of people, you become more aware that there's a bigger horizon and there are not necessarily different answers, but answers that can be delivered in a different way, okay? So that's important for us to be aware of. When someone has disappointed us, it's easy to give up without resolving. I'm sure you've done that. You've just walked away from the friendship, or you've truncated that friendship and said, if that person's going to behave like that, I don't want to be friends with them. Disappointment shouldn't destroy our relationship with others, but make the relationship stronger. Because we don't always fully understand what the other person is going through as to why they've said that or made that decision. So it's our responsibility to sort of find out what is disturbing that person and see if we can help them to find a solution. Right? That's called being a disciple in Christ. And I've just got the example there, Peter and Christ. You know what? The Lord Jesus Christ said some tough stuff to Peter, to help him grow up, to help him mature, to help him to see life from a different perspective. So sometimes, we call it tough love, don't we? And sometimes we have to say things because we are friends, but we say it in a nice and a gentle and compassionate way. And of course, we've got to recognise we have our own faults as well. God's word says we're to show respect to each other. So when we're disappointed with others, it proves they are as human and fallible as we are. So if we can work on that plane in acknowledging that we have similar difficulties in life, then that can be helpful in those relationships. So let's have a look at the process. I'm going to say how to overcome disappointment is here, layered in Elijah's life. So the first point is, if you're feeling disappointed or you've got mental anxiety or frustration or you're worried about what's going on in life, the first thing to do is not read the Bible. I'm not sure whether I should say that, but yeah, you can read the Bible. But the first thing is, make sure you're getting enough sleep and food, right? Because we have to be physically nourished to be in a reasonably healthy state to begin the process. And you'll see that in verse 5 to 8 here. This is how God treats depression. All right, so what happens in verse 5? Elijah lay down, he slept, and behold, an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. And Elijah ate in verse 6. Verse 7, the angel came a second time. So there's I find this quite wonderful. There's a gentleness right there. God didn't grab Elijah by his collar and say, stand up, get back into Israel and do your job. He didn't say that at all. He sent an angel who touched Elijah, and there was no lecture, there was no threat, there was no reproach. He just said, here's some food. You need to nourish yourself. You need to get enough sleep, and you need to get some food as well. And so I think one of the beautiful aspects of our lives is that the angels are ministering spirits, and we sometimes forget that when we're feeling disappointed with ourselves or others. We forget that the angels are doing their very best to minister, it's Paul's definition in Hebrews, to minister to us and to help us through a situation. So the touch of an angel is particularly helpful. Then you'll notice in verse 7 that the angel says, arise and eat because the journey's too great for you. Now, the angel gave some resources which were important, and you'll notice as well that Elijah went, verse 8, 40 days and 40 nights down to Mount Horeb. Now, that's 40 days is a long time, and in fact you can do it in 11, because Deuteronomy 1 verse 2 says there's 11 days journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. So if you're walking that, normally it would only take you 11. It took Elijah 40 days because he's sort of still wandering all over the place. And I think our journey in the truth sometimes takes a bit longer than we think. I thought it was going to be a really, a quick journey for me to the kingdom. 2 years after I was baptised, I thought that was about the sort of length of my journey. And here I am now, 50 years later. So the journey sometimes takes a bit longer. So I think as long as you guys know the journey might take a bit longer, then that's helpful, and we have supernatural food to help us on that journey. Because, well, that food lasted 40 days, didn't it, with his journey. So that's important as well. He went down to the mountain of God, down to Mount Sinai. Any thoughts on why Elijah would choose Mount Sinai? I mean, why is he going there, do you think? Any thoughts? Because of Moses? Yeah, well, I think so. Going back to sort of the beginning of the nation. Like the nation hadn't resolved itself or repaired, so he's going back to the beginning where the nation was first constituted in Mount Sinai. And for all of us, sometimes when we make wrong decisions, we've got to go back to the beginning, back to the foundation, back to the starting point, and let's say, hey, let's give this another go. Let's begin again. So this is what Elijah's doing. He's going back to the starting point. So secondly, of course, here we go. We've already sort of talked about this, and angelic assistance was dispatched, verse 7. Let's remember that happens in our lives. All of you guys have been handed out an invitation to the kingdom, and the angels are working behind the scenes because they're ministering spirits. They want to get you to the kingdom. Okay, so they're working their best. Sometimes we make bad choices, and it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to sort of give us further options. But we need to know that the angels are working, and that's a helpful thought process when we're feeling a little bit disappointed. Third point, you'll notice here in verse 9 and 10 that Elijah was offered to verbalise his frustration. See at the end of verse 9, what are you doing here, Elijah? Tell me about it. Talk to me. So this is an important aspect as well. When we're disappointed or frustrated, we need to verbalise to someone. In my life, I've got Auntie Beth, which is really, really helpful. So I can offload to Auntie Beth, which is really what marriage is about, and extended relationships, the ecclesial family is all about, we can offload to one another, as long as we don't overload each other. So, to be able to verbalise is really important, to talk to people, to communicate, and, prayer is just amazing. Prayer is, we've always got someone who has a listening ear, and that psychologically is really, really helpful for us. So prayer, again, is something that's important in our lives, to be able to vent and verbalise our frustrations to God and maybe to others as well. Fourthly, God reminded Elijah of his awesome power. Verse 11 and 12, of course, there's the wind, the fire and earthquake. So Elijah, who thought he was a powerful prophet, is quivering inside a cave because there's a massive display of natural phenomena that put Elijah back into perspective. That God had the ultimate and awesome power, of which Elijah was just a small manifestation. So again, we've got to think of God's amazing power and ability to change things in life. I've witnessed it, I've had experiences of that where I thought circumstances would go this way and amazingly overnight they changed. So God has this power that we accept in faith, that he can do changes if he desires and if it's to the betterment. So he recognised God's power as well, which we do. Fifthly, he was recommissioned a renewal of purpose. Sometimes when we're disappointed, everything's black and gloomy and it's grey and fuzzy, we lose our purpose in life. What am I here? What am I doing? And that's the fifth point here in verse 15. Elijah was recommissioned, and there were three elements that he was to do to anoint Jehu and also Elisha and Hazael. So, God didn't say, well, you're useless in this cave. He actually gave him a task to do. So, we've got to think of, well, what can I do? Moving forward, what should I hope to achieve? And there may be something that can give us, further direction in life. Sixthly, in verse 18, his perspective was restored. You see, he thought he was the only one in Israel. He said, I'm the only one in Israel who is worshipping faithfully. And God said, Elijah, in your depression, in your state, you've got tunnel vision, or almost mirror vision. You're only seeing yourself. You know what? There's 7,000 knees. There's 7,000 people that haven't bowed to Baal. That's how of synchronisation you've got. So again, perspective is important. And reading the Bible is really important for us because we get that perspective. It helps us to recalibrate what is the right perspective. So that's important as the sixth point as well. Then the seventh point is, again, companionship. Verse 19 to 21, Elisha comes on board. Elisha comes on board. He's a friend, a good friend. We need that in life, young people. When we're going through a difficult time, rather than lock ourselves in our room and turn our phones off, we need to reach out and just say to people, you know what, I'm struggling a bit. Can I lean upon you? Can I talk to you? You may not have all the answers, but that's fine. I just want someone to listen. And Elisha, again, came alongside of Elijah, and again, just to have that companionship and friendship was a wonderful thing. So here I'm just going to step through a summary for ourselves. When we're disappointed with someone else or with ourselves, this is what we do. Number one, make sure you look after yourself, get enough natural sleep and food. Sounds pretty simple, but so many of us jump that step and we're sort of like, I'm trying to solve a problem here. So we just got to step back and, look after ourselves a little bit more. Listen to God's counsel. There's the angel there that comes and visits. has a conversation, a quiet conversation, a nice conversation, a comforting conversation. Listen to, there's some beautiful psalms that are very, very helpful for us. Prayer. Make sure you verbalise your disappointment. You might want to go into a quiet spot and actually shout your frustration to God, and that's okay. There are many, many Bible characters that did that. Remember we talked about Hannah. High priest Eli saw her lips moving because she was verbalising. He thought she was drunk. So, be able to verbalise through prayer is particularly important, especially for us who are baptised. We can take it to the next level of seeking forgiveness as well. Fourthly, remember God's awesome power. He is the creator. He has awesome resources, and he can move mountains in our lives if he needs to. Keep involved in ecclesial work or a youth group and have a purpose in what you do. Do something in the ecclesia. And young people are really, really important in the growth and development of ecclesia, committees, youth groups, suburban, all of those things, Hebron. We can put up our hand to do something, might not be on the committee, but it can be a helping thing. And then we get known to be of a generous spirit. And people ask us to do things, and that builds our self-esteem. Evaluate whether our perspective is correct. Have we just got tunnel vision? Are we only seeing the problem from this point? Or is there a bigger perspective? Just as Elijah was taught, there's 7,000 other people who are faithful. Sometimes, maybe in our friendships, we're disappointed with someone, and we think, well, if the whole of Christadelphia is going to be like this, I don't want to be part of it. And that's wrong thinking, because there are myriads of lovely brothers and sisters who are very faithful, both young and old. So let's not get our perspective out of sync. And last point, seek a good friend who can provide you with support, and spiritual companionship is really good. And there's Elisha. He comes alongside, and together, these two men become major prophets in the history of Israel. And they needed each other. Elijah ultimately passed off the scene. But friendship, our youth group here tonight, is critical, isn't it, in helping and supporting and showing our faithfulness just by simply being here is a great thing. So I'm just going to finish off with the positive benefits of disappointment. Okay, so what are they? They're teachers. All right, we learn from that experience. So don't bury yourself in disappointment. Realise that there are teaching elements in it. There may be indicators of problems that have to be dealt with in our lives. Maybe there's bad choices we've made, and there's a red flag that's come up, and perhaps we've been unconscious in what we're doing, and suddenly we're stopped. Disappointment is also times of adjustments, and life is a wonderful adjusting process. And the scriptures are here to help tweak us in our performance in following Jesus. And sometimes we head off on a tangent, and so disappointment's a time when we sort of, well, where am I going? What am I doing? I need to readjust. They're necessary for us to be fully developed. We quoted James, who talks about the trials of life. You want to be a better person? Well, face that obstacle and work your way through it. Don't put your back to it and run away. That's the lesson there in Elijah's life. Flexible thinking. Disappointments help us to be a little bit more flexible. We're not so rigid in the way that we think the solution should be this, because, well, we've had a conversation with someone and we never realise what they're going through, so that becomes very, very helpful. Look at your expectations and make them a little bit more realistic. Maybe we're a bit like Elijah and we set our expectations for ourselves, or maybe others up here, and maybe we don't want to lower our expectations too much, but maybe they need to be tweaked a little bit and a bit more realistic. Choose activities which make our life satisfying. Like tonight, we come here, we feel renewed and refreshed. We're part of a youth group. We know where we're going in life. We know there's a better future. That's helpful. Share your feelings with someone or write them down. I keep a journal, and I found it really, really helpful to look back 10, 20, 30 years and to see some of the things we've gone through and how God has helped, through the circumstances of life, resolve those issues, which I wouldn't have thought about if I didn't write a diary. I think that's why David writes a lot of Psalms, because they were therapeutic to him when he revisited them. So, that's a helpful thing as well. If you can't influence an event, accept it and, try to work with that particular situation. And finally, learn from our disappointments progressively, one step at a time. We're not going to solve everything in life, but if we can take one step forward at a time, then ultimately we'll progress toward the ecclesia. So, young people, you know, this has been a lovely experience to have a look at the life of Elijah, to know that great characters were disappointed in themselves, in others, or in God. We're following the same pathway. Let's appreciate the disappointments we have in life.